I'm Laura Flanders. 2014 in the USA marks the 50th anniversary of many civil rights movement struggles. Lots of people are asking about the lessons we can bring from that era to this one. But not so many are asking that question of and about the white community. Mab Segrest is a writer, activist, professor, and the author of several books. She grew up during the civil rights movement in Alabama, and she's written about and against white supremacy, patriarchy, and homophobia her entire life. Her influential and crucial autobiography, Memoir of a Race Traitor, continues to inspire me, not to mention a new generation of activists. I'm hugely happy my friend Mab Segrest agreed to come back on the show. Thanks for coming in.
Glad to be here.
Let's start at the very beginning, Mab. I know this story, but not everybody out there does. You grew up in Alabama at the height of the civil rights movement. What did you see?
Well, it wasn't just Alabama. It was Tuskegee, Alabama, Macon County. So there's particular local cultures in terms of race and civil rights. And Tuskegee was the home of Tuskegee Institute, and it had the largest, when I was growing up, proportion of black people of any county in the United States, 85 to 89% there. And there was a white minority, as across the South, that controlled like 10 to 15% controlled 85%.
And do you remember how you made sense of that as a kid?
It didn't occur to me very much until it started occurring to everybody. I mean, until the civil rights movement literally came to town, and not only came to town, but came to our front yard. I mean, I think I had been fairly complacent. I knew certain kinds of things. I had had conversations with my mother, but in 1963, schools desegregated in Alabama. The first 4 public schools desegregated. So it was my high school. I was in the 9th grade. I got up ready to go to school, knowing we're going to be integrated. And my dad came and said, I'm not going to go to school because George Wallace had sent 100 state troopers, some of them on horses, to close down the school.
George Wallace, the
Yeah.
governor of Alabama, right, who in his inauguration address talked about segregation, pitched directly
Right.
to the segregationists,
Right.
and his famous phrase was segregation now,
Right.
segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Right.
So troopers to your front yard.
Yeah, not only, well, the media were in our front yard. We were 2 doors down from the school. The troopers were surrounding the school, so we were all surrounding the troopers, and I was kind of under the bushes looking out at everything. And it was quite incredible, and all of a sudden everything stopped. I mean, everybody in the town had been really gearing up since August to make integration work.
Yeah.
I mean, surprisingly, given all the resistances that happened later. The Board of Education had put things into place. Their student council, I'd gone to student council meetings, and we had plans to kind of segregate the social activities, but we're going to just try to make it work. When that happened, though, Wallace really put a kind of wrench into the works, and in the next week, there was a whole set of moves and counter moves by him and Fred Gray, who was the African-American lawyer who had brought the suit in the first place. And they went in to get a federal restraining order, and then Wallace threatened to bring out the National Guard, and then the federal judge, Frank Johnson, threatened to nationalize the National Guard. So within a week, 13 black students came to the school, but white students by then had pretty much been discouraged.
You mentioned that your family weren't on the desegregation side of things. Right. They were actually, you have a personal connection to
Right.
one of the killings of that year.
Right. The killing was 3 years later, but 63 to 66 really is kind of a portal for Tuskegee, and certainly for me in these 50-year commemorations. And it turned out in that week of interregnum that Wallace stopped everything, that 4 parents got together and decided to go to Wallace and to start a segregated private school, which was the first in Alabama because Tuskegee was the first public school to desegregate in Alabama. So by the time school had opened, there was a movement of white parents to start what turned out to be Macon Academy, which I went to. I was quite surprised that my mother had done it.
Surprised that they'd sent you to the school? To the
Well,
segregated
that they
school?
started the school. I mean, they didn't just send me to it, they started it, you know. So it was quite confusing, but it was for me this moment of kind of emancipation in terms of consciousness, to see how much force could be marshaled to stand between children, and to realize that there was something profoundly wrong with the kind of white supremacist mindset that was behind all of this. I mean, I had never seen it played out quite so vigorously.
And how did this experience whether you were sitting behind the couch listening or not, shape who you've become?
In terms of 50th anniversaries, in 1966, Sammy Young, who was one of the SNCC leaders in town, was shot and killed at a gas station, having asked the white station attendant to go to a white bathroom, and he was sent around the door to the back, and he protested, and there was an altercation, and he ran, and the station attendant had a rifle and shot him in the back of the head and killed him. And his name was Mab Segrest. He was a cousin of mine, distant cousin. I never met him, but I do remember the phone call though that night where my dad had gotten a call from the jail and came in and said Marvin Segrest had shot Sammy Young. I didn't know who either Marvin Segrest or Sammy Young was there. There were demonstrations in town. Segrest, who said he had done it, he was standing there with a rifle, was indicted later, was acquitted by an all-white jury in the next county, which didn't have any black people on the voting rolls. And it was the end of tactical nonviolence. SNCC came out 3 days later against the war in Vietnam, which was the first civil rights organization to do that. And there was an upsurge in black voter registration, especially from the county, and a shift towards black power, which is what SNCC and Sammy Young and those folks had been much more involved in. So that in the liberal regime, the white sheriff had been good to appoint one black deputy, but then soon after that they elected the first black sheriff in the South. So that window, you know, really in terms of these 50-year anniversaries and the one that's coming up, frame my intensest memories of that time.
And your growth out of that?
It terrified me, actually. I mean, the more I thought about it, the more I saw in my family and outside of it, the more I just felt like I have to get away. I didn't realize until later, when I went to Duke to graduate school in the 70s and then came out as a lesbian, that there was a sense of like, I can't live here. You know, this
self-preservation.
Yeah. So when I came out, though, very soon, it was a very vibrant and political lesbian community in Durham, and they were doing all kinds of activism. So I started doing feminist and anti-racist activism very soon there. And then that allowed me to go back and pick up the experiences from my childhood and make more sense of them than I'd been able to make.
You made beautiful sense of those experiences in your book, Memoir of a Race Traitor, and I encourage anybody who's listening to Mab now to pick up the book and read it through. But there are a couple of things that you address in the book that I'd like to just pick out. One is white guilt. Looking at your story, a lot of people might say, how did you ever get the chutzpah up to go back and work in the black community, let alone work against white supremacy? What did you do with your own sense of personal and family responsibility? And is it personal, the guilt?
Right. Well, I mean, you just do a structural analysis. You know, I mean, what's happened in the South? What was the history of slavery? What's happening in the economy? Why are all these people in the 80s white people being pulled into Klan movements? What's happened with the economy that way? What's the history of struggle? How do we relate to this? Who are other white people who have been in the struggle before? I mean, it's subjective, but it's never just personal, and we're embedded in our families that way, and all this kind of stuff around subjectivity. So, and I did a critique of like a history of on being white and other lies. I took the genealogy that my mother had left to me to be in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the colonial dames, Daughters of the American Revolution, so that I had white ancestors back to like 1609 in Jamestown, and so I just followed them up and told a story of white settler colonialism and what happened to white people in those struggles. And by the time I was able to recognize it, some of the things that were impacting my own family from having fought in racist wars and been in racist structures and stuff like that. I mean, I just, in some visceral way, recognized this kind of profound damage to my parents and our family structures that went back to generations that felt like, to me, increasingly had a lot to do with race. So it was like, how do white people understand race doesn't just stop here, but we're constituted by it, which was kind of the field of whiteness, all this whiteness stuff, which was coming along the 80s too.
Now, there's been some criticism of whiteness studies in that it suggests to some that whites are somehow the victims. That's not what you're saying, obviously.
No, it just, whites are not neutral in it, right? No, this is not reverse discrimination at all, but it's the kind of racist position is that whites are neutral and look out at all those people of color who have various pathologies who are working so hard or have these cultures that are so kind of exotic and colorful. And we're just, but we're not in the picture. So after generations, if not centuries, of black people saying white people need to kind of attend to your own histories, then that was that way. It was that effort to kind of trace the history of white emergence of white identities in the context of white settler colonialism, and just to de-essentialize it in a way. But also, I think the other part of my book that folks have appreciated is also a record of activism. And this is not just like, oh, well, my identity. It's like, because of this identity, within this identity, for various reasons, I'm like doing this kind of activism, and I'm documenting it. What does it feel like to be a white person, a lesbian with my family history, who's like doing lots of work across North Carolina for 6 years?
So in terms of the 50-year anniversary and the issues that were up for debate, that were being fought over at that point, which was, among other things, economic self-determination, political representation, access to public goods, and mobility through the society, you can add to the list. What's happened?
Well, we haven't broken that paradigm yet, clearly, and it's a very Southern paradigm that has national and I think global repercussions.
The paradigm of white supremacy, or one group supremacy in power?
And how it's manipulated and held in place. You know, I mean, racist violence in 1966, Sammy Young is shot, killed. Trayvon Martin, 2 years ago, with stand your ground laws in 26 states, it says, if you're afraid of them, shoot them. You know, if you need to defend yourself because you're afraid, then shoot them, and that's defense in court. And most
Which was
of the
the
Southern
argument
states,
most of the Klan leaders made. Well, I was under threat.
Right, and what Marvin Segrest made after he shot Sammy Young and got off for that. Or lack of access to public resources and public goods, which has always been brutal in the kind of slave and post-slave South. And now with the states, 23 states, I think, somewhere in the 20s, have turned down Medicaid from the Affordable Care Act.
Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, and 10 of them are in the southern states, but almost 80% of the people who are being denied insurance from the Affordable Care Act are in the South, because those legislatures are turning away, and there's higher concentrations of poor people, many of whom are people of color. If it's stand your ground, if it's the Medicaid refusal, if it's supermajorities, if it's kind of Republican ideology and organizing that's in such a contest in the rest of the country, there's a Southern base to that, and the ideology is very recognizable from a history of a slave and a post-slave culture. You know, you can look at it too from the Southwest, and you can see the conquest of Mexico in 1848. You can see what happened to indigenous people. You can read all of those things, but they're still there in our DNA. We have not broken that at all. So those kind of battles, they're very familiar battles. We have records of them, and there's new strategies too.
Talk about some of those new strategies. Are we hearing the same language used today as was used 50 years ago, or has it gone in for an update? Are we seeing
I think
some
there's
new
definitely an
frames?
update. I mean, the two of the organizations in the South friends are working on that I'm most excited about is Project South, for the elimination of poverty and genocide, and Southerners on New Ground, or SONG. And Project South came out of the movements of the 60s with SNCC folks at the helms of them, and have been doing very wonderful organizing for 50 years now. With new leadership now, a younger leadership has been passed on. They helped to host the first U.S. Social Forum in Atlanta after Katrina, and really focused on Katrina and the diaspora there and organizing in response to it, which really shook Southern organizers, and people realized there was a whole different level when the state abandons you at that level, not only New Orleans, but all the way across. What do you do? What's more self-sufficiency? What's more interdependence in communities? And how can you hold states accountable, and when are you not able to? You know,
And so?
And then Southerners on New Ground, formed in probably 1992 or 93. I was one of the 6 founders, so I'm very proud here. Southern lesbians, black and white, who had been working both within lesbian gay movements on broader issues of equality, and within those broader movements on questions of sexism, sexuality, homophobia. So right now, SONG is doing really brilliant organizing across the Southeast, to very queer, very, very multi-issue, very networked into a range of organizations where it's not single issue anymore, it's not identity-based anymore. Liberation in our lifetime, queer liberation in our lifetime, kinship, ignite the kinship. I mean, it's very, both of those organizations I'm totally proud of and really inspired by.
If you had one message to people who are trying to take advantage of this 50th anniversary to maybe bone up on history they never knew, or teach classes they never taught, or read books they never read, or do things they hadn't done before. You know, what's your message?
Be brave. What's that song? I want to see you be brave. I want to see me be brave. You know, I mean, it's such an amazing piece of history where so many people together decided to be so brave, and that there was something worth more than their lives.
Thank you so much for
You're
coming
welcome.
in.